Welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on democracy and human rights in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'd like to welcome our witnesses, and I want to thank them for sharing their expertise and in-country experience with us today. I'm pleased to see the State Department so ably represented by Assistant Secretary Tom Malinowski and my former colleague in Congress, Tom Perriello, who currently serves as Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region of Africa. I very much look forward to hearing your testimonies. I want to extend a special welcome to those of you from the DRC who are joining us this morning. I'd like to recognize the DRC's Chief Diplomatic Advisor to President Kabila, Ambassador Barnaby Kikaya, and the DRC Ambassador to the U.S., Ambassador Balamuni. Thank you very much for being with us today. I also want to recognize Mr. Mayombo Mabanza, a lawyer who represents the DRC diaspora in Chicago. Your presence is a good indicator of the importance and relevance of this hearing. We are here today because the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which the United States considers a strategic priority due to its size, location, and role in Africa's Great Lakes region, is facing a constitutional crisis. In 2002, the U.S., working with African and European partners, helped facilitate a Congo peace accord that included a democratic transition and free elections under a new constitution limiting the president to 2 terms. In 2006, Joseph Kabila, who assumed the presidency in 2001 after the assassination of his father, was elected president in his own right in a landmark election that was widely viewed as credible. He was reelected in 2011, although the analyses of that election by international observers was not as positive. President Kabila's second term is scheduled to end in about 3 weeks on December 19th. But it seems that the President has no intention of stepping down on that date. On the contrary, for the last couple of years, the President and his party have repeatedly sought to delay, in a variety of ways, the elections that should have taken place this year, and they have succeeded. Elections that were scheduled by the National Electoral Commission for last November 27th failed to occur, and it's now too late to elect a replacement for Mr. Kabila before the 19th. Meanwhile, we will hear today that the human rights situation in the DRC has deteriorated as government repression against pro-democracy activists, opposition political leaders, protesters, and the media has intensified. The State Department's 2015 Human Rights Report on the DRC noted, and I quote, increased intimidation of political and civil rights activists and journalists in the form of arbitrary arrests, prolonged detention, and threats, and restrictions on the ability to change the government peacefully, end quote, as well as, and I quote, widespread impunity and corruption throughout the government, end quote, state security force abuses, and a judiciary that is, quote, corrupt and subject to influence, end of quote. So what happens next? That's the question we're trying to answer today. There's a lot of concern up here on the Hill that the conflict will deepen after the 19th, that protests could mushroom, leading to increased repression and mass violence. The administration has pursued many strategies in its effort to help consolidate democracy in the DRC, including targeted sanctions and calling for a negotiated solution on the timing of elections, and we will hear more about those efforts today. I'm especially interested in the views of the witnesses on the recent political agreement reached under the auspices of the African Union, but with very limited participation by opposition leaders, that would postpone elections until 2018 while allowing Mr. Kabila to remain in office until then. We in the Congress have also done our part to insist on the critical importance of adhering to democratic rules of the game. Most recently, we passed House Resolution 780, which calls for more sanctions on DRC officials who impede democratic progress through credible elections, and I'd like to recognize the leadership of my colleagues, Representatives Chris Smith, Karen Bass, Elliot Engel, and Ed Royce, the original co-sponsors of that initiative. Yet, here we are. Some of you may ask why this hearing is so focused on the issue of presidential succession when the DRC faces many other very serious human rights problems, ongoing armed conflict in the East, sexual and gender-based violence, recruitment of child soldiers, conflict minerals. There can be no doubt that these problems are of grave concern, and in fact they have received congressional attention, for example through the conflict minerals legislation of 2010. But one factor distinguishes the current political crisis in the DRC, with its foreseeable risk of increased human rights abuses. It is due primarily to the actions of one man, and that is President Kabila and his supporters and enablers. It is the President's refusal to comply with the letter and spirit of his country's Constitution that is undermining the democratic aspirations of his people and causing this crisis, and it is within his power to defuse it. To do so, to rise above his personal desires and motivation, to put his country first, would be the sign of a true statesman and political leader. That is what democracy requires, and it would set a very important example for neighboring countries where the issue of presidential term limits is also in play: Burundi, Rwanda, the Republic of Congo. We can and should hope that wisdom will prevail in the coming weeks. So, having said that, I would like to recognize our first panel. Tom Perriello, who is the Special Envoy for Great Lakes region of Africa, was appointed by the Secretary of State, John Kerry. He previously served as a very distinguished member of Congress from Virginia's 5th District, and he was formerly also special advisor to the prosecutor of Special Court for Sierra Leone. And he's got a long resume, and I will insert all that in the record, but he is an incredibly distinguished and honorable human being, and we're proud to have him here. And I'm also happy to welcome my friend Tom Malinowski, who was sworn in as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He was the Washington Director on Human Rights Watch. He was the Washington Director for Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading independent international organizations dedicated to defending human rights. He has, again, also an incredibly long and impressive resume, but I can't think of two people better qualified to speak about this issue today, and we want to welcome them, and the floor is yours. And Tom, why don't we begin with you?
Thanks. Of course, that could mean either one of us, right? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the leadership that you've shown and this commission has shown all across the world in standing up for human rights, something that I think is going to become even more intensely important in the years ahead, and in particular for your focus on the DRC today. I want to start by putting the events there in a slightly broader context and then zero back in on what's happening in Kinshasa. One of the most important and hopeful developments we've seen in Africa politically in the last several years has been this extraordinary popular movement for constitutional term limits. All across the continent, ordinary citizens, mostly young people, have been challenging the idea that leaders can change the rules of the game in the middle of the game so that they can stay in power for life. And it is the policy of the United States to stand with those people wherever these movements arise. That policy is not meant to be a judgment on the qualities of any particular leader. It's just based on a judgment that leaders who cling to office for term after term eventually are able to consolidate power around their person in ways that undermine the checks and balances that are necessary for democracy. We think that democracy is stronger when there are regular, peaceful transitions of power from one group of leaders to another and from one generation to another. That's why President Obama said last year when he spoke to the African Union in Addis that no one should be president for life. And I can't think of a statement by any sitting American president that has resonated more positively across the African continent than that statement that President Obama made. We've seen these popular movements succeed in a number of countries, in Burkina Faso, in Senegal, to name two examples. In other countries, leaders have resisted calls to respect term limits. We've seen that in the Republic of Congo and Rwanda, and with very tragic consequences, of course, in Burundi. And now this same drama is playing out again on an even bigger stage with, I think, even bigger potential consequences in the DRC. On December 19th, the second and constitutionally stipulated final term of President Kabila will end. There should have been an election this month to choose his successor. It obviously didn't happen. The government of the DRC has claimed that this delay happened only because elections in the DRC are complicated to organize, they take time to prepare, but obviously the government has always known how long the preparations would take. It deliberately did not start them on time. Instead, it has followed a strategy of bureaucratic delay, which the Congolese refer to in French as glissement, causing the election to be postponed at least until the latter part of 2017. And this has led to widespread anger in the DRC. In a poll released last month by the Congo research group, 81% of respondents rejected changing the constitution to allow Kabila to run for a third term. 74% said he should leave office when his term ends next month. Now, you mentioned the special factor of the DRC's size, its position in the region. It has, as you know, a very bitter history of conflict. The potential for violence and mass atrocities in the DRC, if this situation is not resolved, is very, very real. The civil war there that began in the 1990s, as you recall, arguably took more lives than any other war anywhere in the world since World War II, drawing in neighbors from across the region. So ensuring timely and credible elections and a peaceful transition is incredibly important in a country that is recovering from such recent trauma. Now, President Kabila's refusal to say publicly that he will not seek a third term has already fueled mass protests. Those protests have been met with violence by security forces against peaceful activists, political and religious leaders, and others. In September in Kinshasa, for example, Congolese security forces violently suppressed peaceful protesters. That action left dozens dead and hundreds injured. So far this year, the UN has documented a 216% increase in the number of human rights violations from all of last year. The government has also cracked down on journalists. It has blocked radio signals to deny Congolese access to credible, independent reporting during moments of tension. And that's also very important in terms of avoiding atrocities, to have information freely going in and out of the country. Now, we have been working intensively since the beginning of this crisis to encourage a path forward based on democratic principles and respect for human rights. Special Envoy Perriello has spearheaded our diplomatic efforts, which he will describe in a moment. I will say that we've done this in very close coordination with regional states who worry that they themselves would bear the consequences if the political situation in the DRC were to unravel, and with our partners in Europe. We have signaled our determination to hold accountable those individuals responsible for acts that threaten the DRC's peace and security or that undermine democratic processes and institutions by imposing targeted sanctions, as now has the European Union. We've already sanctioned 3 security personnel responsible for abuses, and more designations will come if abuses and these actions continue. In this context, we should also keep in mind one other thing, and that is the growing allegations of corruption against the DRC government and its financial backers. According to organizations like Global Witness and the Enough Project, corruption is diverting billions of dollars in revenues that should be going to the DRC Treasury and support public services. This is an especially harmful problem given the economic difficulties that the DRC is currently facing. Law enforcement agencies throughout the world are increasingly interested in investigating and prosecuting corruption associated with high government officials when the proceeds enter the international financial system. While this is not the provenance of the State Department, I think it is reasonable to assume that leaders clinging to power in defiance of their people and the international community will find themselves more exposed to such scrutiny. So for all these reasons, I think it should be clear that a peaceful transition consistent with the DRC's constitution would be in the region's best interest, in the country's best interest, and arguably in President Kabila's personal best interest. I am confident that the international community will stay engaged at the highest levels in support of the Congolese people and their pursuit of a more democratic future. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom?
Thank you so much to you and your fellow co-chair for calling this very, very timely hearing. It's at a we see the Democratic Republic of Congo certainly at an inflection point in terms of its security, its constitutional developments, and the enormous impacts thereof. I want to welcome and say hello to the extremely professional and impressive diplomatic leadership of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I've had the honor to work with, as well as some very courageous members of Congolese civil society that are here as well. One thing that I am consistently asked by the Congolese people all over the country is to share with Congress their appreciation for the bipartisan support the United States has shown to the DRC. I've worked in a lot of countries around the world, and rarely have I seen as much appreciation and enthusiasm for American engagement and an understanding that this has gone across different administrations and has consistent interest here on the Hill. And that means a great deal as the country pursues what would be its first peaceful democratic transition of power in a very long and painful history. And while much of what we'll say today is understandably concerning about the situation, we do also want to keep an eye on the positive, which is that while tensions are rising and the economic situation is becoming very fragile, there is still time for this to be a historic development where everybody in leadership through all sectors, majority, opposition, civil society, et cetera, walk away very proud of the statesmanship that has been displayed and a real turning point. As Tom mentioned, we have seen that countries where constitutional term limits and democratic transitions of power are respected tend to see significant security and economic gains after that transition happens. And then over 90% of the countries that have allowed those transitions to happen, they have not gone back and had subsequent constitutional or security crises in Africa. So this is an extremely important test case for the country. The crisis in the DRC was tragically easy to avoid, as it stems almost entirely from the government's failure to prepare for constitutionally required elections in an effort to extend President Kabila's hold on power beyond the end of his second mandate on December 19th. As a result, the government will soon be operating outside of those constitutional parameters, which has created a great deal of uncertainty and instability as we head towards possible clashes on December 19th, when the main opposition coalition, the Rassemblement, intends to take to the streets to protest this situation. It's worth noting President Kabila deserves a great deal of credit over the last 15 years for helping to bring the country out of civil war and into a period of security, helping bring the Constitution into existence, and arguably defending the most open political space in the region for opposition and civil society to operate before turning that trend a bit over a year ago, as was mentioned, towards significant acts to close off those very developments for which we believe he should be so proud. Kabila's popularity in the DRC is now in the single digits, and the Congolese people have made known their desire and expectation for a transfer of power. The United States does not care who wins this election, but we do believe the Congolese people want and deserve the chance to choose their next leader. For nearly 2 years, the president and opposition leaders have proposed various forms of dialogue to resolve outstanding issues related to elections. But these efforts have failed to bring key stakeholders to a single table. The most substantive effort, convened under African Union auspices, made some progress earlier this fall on a series of technical questions, but the process and resulting October 18th agreement failed to garner the participation or support of a quorum of opposition and civil society leaders. While a foundation from which to start, the October 18th agreement did not provide adequate guarantees about the president's commitment to leave power and would delay elections until April 2018, a position that is generally met with great resistance from the population as well as civil society experts. Under pressure from regional leaders who fear a widening crisis in the DRC, Kabila did ask the highly respected Conference of Catholic Bishops, or CENCO, to lead further discussions in pursuit of a more inclusive agreement. We strongly welcomed the president's decision to invite this role by the bishops and fully support what is the best effort and perhaps the last effort to find resolution ahead of December 18th. The Catholic bishops are deeply respected not only among the Catholic community, but provide many life-saving services well beyond the Catholic community across the country in many places that NGOs and even the government have trouble operating. They gave the benefit of the doubt to the earlier rounds of negotiations, but had to abandon that process based on its failure to meet inclusivity and constitutional standards. So this development is extremely important. We have put very clear pressure on both the president and the opposition to give full cooperation to this process. President Kabila has moved forward with appointing a new prime minister on November 17th, based on what he sees as an urgent need to implement the October 18th agreement. This was seen as undermining to some extent the Senko process, but not fatally killing it, and we appreciate that all sides have continued to engage on some level in this process. Supporting Senko's effort is our top priority from now until December 19th, along with deterring not only violent repression from the government, but any turn to violence by the opposition as well. I was in Kinshasa recently and will be returning later this week because I believe there is still a window for the bishops to succeed and, by extension, for all the Congolese people to succeed. U.S. government officials are in near constant contact with stakeholders on all sides, pushing them to work with Senko in good faith and to offer realistic proposals and to prioritize consensus over individual or party gain. There will need to be compromises on all sides to reach an agreement. We've seen some more signs of cooperation in the past 2 weeks, but time is short, and many of the dynamics and momentums headed to December 19th are already in motion. We believe that an agreement is more likely to succeed in reaching consensus and thus averting potential violence or instability and leading the country to timely elections if it has a few key elements, which we can probably talk about during an exchange, but certainly an electoral timeline that guarantees presidential elections within 2017, as the technical experts have said is possible, has enormous psychological advantage, among other things, within the country. A guarantee that the Constitution will not be amended, building on some of the stronger statements President Kabila made recently in his address to the Parliament. An agreement that neither the transitional president nor the prime minister can be a candidate in the next election. We must understand that this is not just about a technical agreement. There is a deep reservoir of distrust between both sides, that any agreement that is reached will be respected. Whether that's a respect for President Kabila and his family after they leave power, or assurances that a deal will not see the majority find ways to extend the election cycle or call a national emergency after a deal is made. The region and international community are nearly unanimous in wanting a consensus agreement. Angola and the Republic of Congo deserve credit for rallying regional support for a constructive solution. We continue to work, of course, with our European partners, as well as support as appropriate to the Catholic Church through the Senko process. If Senko succeeds in brokering an agreement, the international community may have a key role to play in convincing all stakeholders to endorse it and to ensure its implementation. And the United States certainly may be asked to play a role in that process, and we have offered to be a constructive partner. International engagement will be key to holding signatories to their commitments, including through the threat and use of targeted sanctions. The United States has already sanctioned 3 security officials, as was mentioned, and we're continuing to consider additional targets based on events that have already occurred, as well as those that may occur in the coming weeks. While we're working day and night to avert a crisis, we're also working with the UN and DRC peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, on contingency planning for a worst-case scenario. MONUSCO's mandate has a strong civilian protection component and sufficient authorities to respond to electoral violence, but the country is vast and potential needs are great, even with a 20,000 personnel spread across a country of close to 80 million people. Along with Security Council partners, we are working with MONUSCO to prioritize efforts to ensure civilian protection. The United States has been a major partner, as you know, and proponent of peace and development in the DRC across multiple administrations. In recognition of the country's critical importance to the stability of Central Africa and the potential of the Congolese people. And I can tell you, as someone who's spent a great deal of time there are few places on earth that are more inspiring, more beautiful, and have more potential, both human and economic potential, than the DRC. Our continued engagement in the coming months will be crucial to ensuring the country turns a corner from the worst of its past towards the best of its future. Bipartisan congressional support for the DRC has been extremely helpful in empowering our diplomacy and supporting the democratic aspirations of the Congolese people. With so much already invested in the region by the United States and so much at stake in the months ahead, now is the time to intensify our efforts on advancing democracy, stability, and prosperity for the people of the DRC. We will continue to work with the government, the opposition, and civil society in hopes of imagining all have the best motives and the best intentions for this chapter of DRC's history, but we will work hard to deter any actions by any sides that we think could take this into a true regional crisis. Thank you very much for your interest.
Well, thank you both for your testimony, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, but I also want to thank you for your service to our country. during your time in your positions. You know, human rights is obviously very important to me, otherwise I wouldn't be on this commission, but in a very bipartisan way, human rights is of great concern to this Congress, and you both have been really quite incredible, so I want to thank you for your service. But so you mentioned the Catholic Bishops' Conference, SANCO, and it seems that, you know, in the short term that may be the best hope to try to kind of move beyond this impasse. And December 19th is like less than 3 weeks away, so that's not a lot of time. Obviously, we hope that, you know, this effort succeeds. I guess my question would be, you know, what can Congress do to support the SANCO process? Is there anything we can do to be wind at the backs of those who really want to, you know, avoid a conflict and see something concrete happen by the 19th?
Well, some of the actions, I think, have been already very much noticed. We know that there are true hardliners on both sides, the majority and the opposition, those who probably do not want to see a deal reached and believe, I think people on both sides think they would have the advantage if this gets settled in the streets. We think that would be a disaster for the people of Congo. So I think there has certainly been notice of the continued threat of economic sanctions and consequences that has had bipartisan support on the Hill, as well as recent statements from the Europeans. Continuing to support, I think, the diplomatic efforts of this office and others through the transition period is going to be extremely important. As I said, I'm flying out on Friday to get back to see how these efforts are going forward. One of the things that we've heard from some quarters has been, you know, well, what do the Americans want? What is the American plan? And we felt like it's quite important not to have a plan that we determine. It's really something that has to come from the Congolese people and the Congolese stakeholders. Where we feel like there's been broad consensus, for example, on a shorter timeline, we've tried to reinforce the importance of that within a deal. We think that, again, the bishops are taking their role very seriously, and we believe that the Congress showing that their interest will continue through December 19th, but also continue to watch events as they develop thereafter is an important thing for the region to hear.
Well, and I know you said you're going to be traveling there, but I mean, if there are statements that would be helpful to come out of this commission, you know, or us to make on the floor of the House to indicate our support for a process and for people to be, you know, focused on trying to avoid a deeper conflict, let us know. I mean, I think people are watching this very, very carefully. And again, you know, you'll have a better sense of what kind of progress is being made. But again, December 19th is not that long from now. And if there's anything we can do to help push all sides to be reasonable and to try to, you know, put the best interests of the people of the country forward, you know, we're open to doing that. So I just make that statement. You know, is there anything we can do, you know, again in the short term here to encourage the DRC government to release opposition and civil society activists from detention and reverse kind of this growing restriction on press freedom, which again is alarming to many of us as we're watching events unfold? Mr. Malinowski?
Yes, of course, and I think continuing to highlight the issue as you're doing today is helpful, but also highlighting the individual cases. You know, when a radio station is shut down, we all should be speaking about it right away. When activists are arrested, we should be, you know, we should be all over that. And I think when we've done so in the past, we have actually been able to get people who have been unjustly imprisoned released. We have been able to effectively impress on Congolese authorities that these kinds of actions are wrong and not in their interest. And I think, you know, doing it in this critical period, which is both should be a transitional period in the DRC and is a transitional period in the United States, is particularly important because it shows that there will be continuity of effort through all of this uncertainty. I think there are, there may be folks in the DRC who are wondering not just what the Americans want, but what are they going to continue to want through this transitional period. My own sense is that this is a policy that is deeply rooted in our values and interests. It has bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress. It reflects not just an American position, but the position of the Europeans, of the regional countries, and it will continue for all of those reasons. But I think to the extent there are any questions or doubts about that, reminding everybody that that there will be continuity is extremely important right now.
So, well, Tom, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to add a couple of things. First, I think one of the real values that has already been expressed by Chairman Royce, Congressman Smith, yourself on this side, Senators Flake, McCain, Markey, and others, is that we've seen this movie before. If you spend weeks and months closing off avenues for legitimate political dissent, peaceful rallies, access to the media, detaining young activists, and then things explode on your watch. The reality is the government has an affirmative obligation, not just to not detain and beat its citizens, but also an affirmative obligation to create that space. And too often we've seen that when a government does not allow legitimate opposition, you see illegitimate or more hardline opposition rise up. And while we will continue to deter that and tell the opposition there will be consequences, if we get to that situation, that responsibility still lies primarily with the government. And I think the statements, the bipartisan statements that Congress has already made clear, because you all have the benefit of seeing this over many years and many different countries, to understand basically that playbook is not something that's going to fool people up here. So I think setting that standard early, as has been done, is extremely important. Now, we've also obviously communicated to the opposition that if we see armed resistance like we saw in Burundi, we sanction individuals in the opposition, both those who were involved in a coup attempt and those who took up arms afterwards. So we certainly want to message that to both sides, but there's no question that a government has a unique and affirmative obligation to its citizens, and that the tension that is rising right now, both in terms of the extreme economic fragility and uptick of inflation, as well as the political repression, are based on proactive steps that the government has taken that is helping to create this situation. And therefore, we do see a particular need for them to see responsibility in finding a solution. So all of those are going to be important elements, I think, that we've continued to hear from this end of Pennsylvania Avenue.
So kind of going back to the question about what Congress can do, and I appreciate Mr. Malinowski's response, but we're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. I mean, of the congressional actions that have been taken so far, what do you think has been the most effective tools that we have used? And and several actors have called for targeted sanctions against a larger number of DRC government officials and of greater seniority. Do you share their view that more and higher level sanctions would be effective at preventing a violent crisis? Is that something we should be taking a look at?
Well, I mean, we're not only taking a look at it, we're doing it. We have begun to impose targeted sanctions. The intent here is to steadily ratchet those up if necessary. We would, of course, be very, very happy if we never had to impose another sanction in the DRC again, and our message to the government has been that is a very possible outcome, that the door is open here to a solution that will resolve this crisis and enable us not to have to use this tool, but that we are prepared to steadily escalate the sanctions against higher and higher level officials in the DRC. If the human rights abuses continue, if there are continued threats to the peace and stability of the country and to a democratic transition. One of the things that we have been particularly focused on in the last month, even as we think about our own sanctions, is to try to multilateralize the targeted sanctions. So we have worked quite assiduously to encourage the European Union to follow our lead, and indeed the EU has decided to begin its own targeted sanctions program. I think that sends a very, very important message that, again, this is not just the United States. There is a united international community. And while there is a way out of the crisis, there is also a path that will result in greater and greater pressure being placed on President Kabila and others around him if they continue to resist the way out that has been offered.
Tom, yeah.
Yeah, I think that I'm tempted to take a straw poll of the room, but I won't, that if you ask the majority of Congolese stakeholders on all sides, they would believe that the targeted sanctions have been extremely important and noticed. I think that this is an incredibly dynamic and impressive elite in the DRC who are very cosmopolitanly engaged around the world, an incredibly impressive diaspora, and a tremendous amount of talent. And I think the issue about access, financial and personally, to the U.S. and EU is certainly something that would be a serious consequence for individuals involved and has been taken notice. There have been points, while we've been very concerned, obviously, about the closing of political space and detentions by the government, there have been some situations where less violent or repressive tactics were used to close that space, including some rather creative efforts to stop recent peaceful rallies by having 12-hour-long soccer matches in the parade routes. On the one hand, obviously, it's positive when they're not shooting and using RPGs like we saw on September 19th. On the other hand, it doesn't solve the problem. It's still creating the pressure cooker. It's still cutting off the space for legitimate dissent that then makes the idea of more violent dissent more likely. So certainly that's a factor that people are looking at. I think there's also at this point a serious, by most reports, a very serious fiscal and budget crisis coming up. We have obviously preferred more targeted sanctions because we want to focus on the individuals responsible and as much as possible and not have people suffer. Unfortunately, during recent trips by the World Bank and IMF, the country was not meeting basic transparency or stability standards to see the kind of support that might be necessary to avert greater economic pain in the coming months. The EU has talked about revisiting its development partnerships after December 19th. I think there are going to be a series of difficult questions to be asked at that point. But I think right now we feel like this is in the hand of a limited number of individuals, quite frankly, on the government side and the opposition side, who are in a position to come together and reach a consensus. And we would like to target as much of our not just our negative incentives, but our positive incentives on those who might be able to help bring that together.
Got a couple more questions here. What are the primary factors behind the decision by regional heads of state to endorse the October 2016 political agreement at the recent heads of state meeting and summit in Angola? To what extent do you believe that the regional heads of state share the administration's concerns about the DRC's government's crackdown on the rights and freedoms of the Congolese people? What options do you see working with regional heads of state and the African Union to promote the outcome that the administration has sought in the DRC, i.e., timely, credible elections as called for by the DRC's constitution, culminating in a peaceful transition?
I would say that while our tactics may be different, I think one of the things that gives me hope about the situation right now is that we actually see the situation quite similarly to the neighbors and have aligned in many ways, perhaps coming from different motivations or different perspectives, but reaching the same conclusion, which is that a situation where things start to destabilize December 19th is bad for the Congolese and bad for the region, particularly those likely to see significant refugee flows, and a pretty strong sense that the deal so far doesn't cut that. Now, how much one says in public versus private and tactics that are more of, say, an American style don't necessarily work for others, but I think this is not about agreeing on every detail. It's agreeing about how important it is diplomatically to avoid this crisis, and an awareness that the efforts so far have not been sufficient in bringing enough people into a deal with enough guarantees of a transition to avoid that crisis. So I think we are working very well, again, with allies and strategic partners across the continent as well as Europe in those efforts.
And I guess my final question is, going back to the Catholic bishops' efforts, so what happens if they can't come to some sort of agreement by the 19th? What do we expect the next steps to be? I mean, I don't want to sound pessimistic here, or I don't want to undercut the potential of success, but I mean, we're talking less than 3 weeks away. I mean, what do we, what do we anticipate follows not coming to an agreement?
I think nobody knows. It's a little bit of through the looking glass at December 19th, but I think one of the concerns is that there's a loss of control by all actors, including the president himself, over the events that go from there. What we saw if September 19th and 20th was a preview of the tactics being used by both sides, I think we could see things spin out of control very, very quickly. On the other hand, we saw massive rallies when opposition leader Etienne Tshisekedi returned in late July with perhaps as many as 1 million people in the street. The police acted professionally, and people went on with their business the next day. So anything is possible, but I would say the general sentiment is a deep level of concern that if we get to that point, the protests could be massive. They could become antagonistic. If the police, and particularly the Presidential Guard, use the kind of tactics that we've seen previously, this could be a very, very bad situation. I think that's what the neighbors hope to avoid, what all of us hope to avoid. But again, in the absence of a deal, the chances of that are go up, and that's one of the reasons I think we're hoping that all sides go in that direction. You also have individual consequences. I mean, I think, one of the things, as I said earlier, is that President Kabila right now has very much the chance to leave a national hero. He has an incredible future, whether that's as a comeback politician or businessman or whatever, academic, whatever he wants to be. Unbelievable talent, came in at a young age. People expected very little of him. He's constantly surpassed expectations, including bringing the country to the Sun City Accords, bringing the Constitution into being. And he still very much has the chance to leave with this unbelievable legacy. But if we end up in a situation with hundreds of dead bodies in the street, that's a very different reality, both in terms of his international relationships and partnerships and investment, but also, concerns about the ICC and other things that come in at that point. So we're now in a world before we have to worry about those things, where, again, everybody can leave really getting, a hero's departure, or we can get into a situation that could be deeply concerning.
Do you think the president fully appreciates that fact?
The president's a smart man. He's been head of one of the largest countries in the world since he was 28, 29 years old. He's also someone who tends to keep his cards very close to his chest with most people. So I can't know for sure. We've certainly tried to meet with him on every trip. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But I do think he, at the end of the day, cares a great deal about his country, and I think he doesn't want to see it dissolve. As he said, he wants to see stability in the country, and our hope is that, that everyone will rise up to their best self in the situation, and we'll find a deal that heads towards that peaceful democratic transition.
And you're leaving when? For next week or?
Friday.
Friday? You plan to meet with the president, or are you hoping to meet with the president?
We will ask, and we would hope to meet with the president.
I would hope that he would see the importance of meeting with you, especially at this moment, and maybe he could offer you some reassurance so that we could all feel a little bit better here. Mr. Milanowski, any final?
I would maybe just to reinforce what Special Envoy Perriello just said. I think we should look to what has happened in Burundi as an example of just how bad things can get. And I think the lesson of Burundi is that at a certain point, a line is crossed that is very difficult to come back across. When there has been violence on both sides, when there has been total polarization, when each side knows that it has done enough to the other side that the other side is not likely to forgive it, and therefore that leads to a psychology in which you feel like your only hope of survival is just to hold on to what you have and not to give an inch. And the result of that dynamic has been just a horrible civil conflict in which hundreds of people died, many have disappeared, been tortured, and we're still working very hard on it, and I haven't given up on Burundi, but it's, you know, it's hard to see going back to a scenario where an election can just solve the problem. So the bad news is that could happen in the DRC. The ingredients are there on a much larger scale. The good news is that I think I'm quite confident that they have not yet crossed that line. The door is still open to a reasonable political compromise that enables the Congolese people, the ruling party, the opposition, President Kabila, to come out of this winners, all of them. And President Kabila has not closed the door to that. He's not said that he's not going to do the things that need to be done in order to achieve that solution. And there is, again, I would stress, a united international community, probably more so than in the case of Burundi, that is willing to lend him and the country a hand if that kind of solution is reached. As you mentioned, we don't have a lot of time, but we will use it. We will use every moment we have to try to get to where we need to be.
Well, I appreciate both of your testimonies, and I want to remain hopeful that you know, in a few weeks we're going to be talking about how we can work to kind of get beyond where we are right now. The frustrating thing is that we all this is also avoidable, and everybody knew this was going to come to this, and it's, you know, now we're down to the final days, and you know, and if it doesn't go right, who's going to suffer the most are the people, you know, and I, you know, I just, you know, we do hearings every week here, and it's always heartbreaking and tragic, you know, to hear about the suffering that's going on in so many parts of the world, so senseless and so needless. And I think, and this is one of these cases where, I mean, you know, if everybody actually rises to the occasion, we can avoid a really nasty, awful situation. And I hope that's the case. I hope the President will meet with you, Mr. Perriello, when you're there. I think it's important because I think he needs to hear that there's a lot of concern. I know his diplomatic people here in Washington are communicating that, but I think it's important for you to be able to communicate that. And anything we can do to be wind at your back, or Mr. Malinowski, same thing, please let us know. But I wish you luck, and thank you so much for your testimony. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next part, the next panelist. November, Hazel. Hazel. Okay.
And then it's and Sasha's last.
So we're going to call our next panel. And I'm hoping I'm going to pronounce your name properly. Please correct me if I don't. Mevemba Pezo Desolé, thank you, who is a writer, a former policy analyst, and an independent journalist, also a lecturer in African Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Desolé was a grantee of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and covered the 2006 elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We're grateful that you are here. Ida Soya, a senior researcher and advocate at the Democratic on the Democratic Republic of Congo. She's been based in Congo since January 2008. However, following a series of Human Rights Watch publications of political repression, Congolese authorities barred Ida from continuing to work in the country in August of 2016. And you're also related to Brian Keane, right? That's right, a good friend of mine, so tell him we said hi. Fred Boma, a Congolese human rights pro-democracy activist with the youth movement. For over 5 years now, he has worked to empower young people to be agents for change through active participation in the socioeconomic and political life of their communities. We're grateful to have you here. And finally, last but not least, Sasha Lezhnev, an Associate Director of Policy at the Enough Project, where he focuses on peace, conflict, and corporate accountability issues in Central Africa. And we appreciate seeing you again. Thank you for all that you all do. Mr. Desolele, we're going to begin with you.
Co-Chairman McGovern, members of the Tom Lantos Commission on Human Rights, thank you for the invitation and honor to testify before your commission today. I speak today in my personal capacity and assume full responsibility for my statement. With your permission, Co-Chair, I would like to submit my prepared remarks for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. The Congolese people are caught in a maelstrom of bankrupt leadership, mismanagement of public resources, breakdown of social contract, and lack of political will at the highest echelon to steer the country to a peaceful, orderly, and democratic transition of power, as mandated by the Constitution. A few weeks ago, on September 19th and 20th, Congo witnessed pro-democracy protests that brought thousands of young people and political opposition partisans to the streets of several cities. The trigger point has been President Joseph Kabila's effort to remain in office beyond the constitutionally mandated 2 terms. While most of the protests across the country remain peaceful, the ensuing police and military repression in the capital city of Kinshasa resulted in tens of youths being either killed by gunfire or arrested. The repression has continued in major cities, particularly Kinshasa, Lubumbashi, and Kisangani, where arbitrary arrest and abduction are now alarmingly common. Political opposition leaders, civil society leaders, youth activists, and other proponents of the respect of the Constitution remain the primary targets of this campaign of repressions. In other words, this is the open season of the state violence against anyone who opposes the subversion of the Constitution. This is unacceptable and needs to stop. Pro-Constitution opposition parties and youth groups have vowed to take to the streets on December 19th, when President Kabila's term ends, as we've heard previously. It is now hard to predict what will happen. Either way, all signs and recent developments indicate that the tensions and violent repression will continue unless appropriate deterring measures are taken and the constitutionality of the electoral process is reinstated. The responsibility of the crisis rests primarily with DRC leaders in parliament and government. Along the way, however, they've been aided and abated by foreign partners, including donor countries and the United Nations. Thus, resolving this crisis requires that all partners, including Congo's neighbors, pull their weight. Donors must commit to the democratic process and transition and back their pledges and declarations with immediate practical, coordinated actions. Credible and peaceful democratic transition goes through the following steps. President Joseph Kabila is the guarantor of the Constitution, and really the only one, and should accept the fact that there is no substitute for his leadership in this matter. He should face the Congolese people and assure them that he will respect the Constitution and step down when his term ends, or not. Donors and partners should support a credible and robust mediation between key stakeholders, including the Catholic Church, the political opposition, the presidential majority and the government, and youth groups to map out a course of action out of this crisis, which will be consistent with the respect of the Constitution and prioritize the aspiration of the Congolese people. The United States has been very supportive of the Congolese people. Unfortunately, we have to continue asking you to do more. And that is to continue supporting the democratic forces that promote this transition within the majority, within the opposition, and within civil society. And really ask President Kabila to step down and let the President of the Senate lead the transition as mandated by the Constitution. The Congress should stress on President-elect Trump team the urgency to appoint a special envoy so the momentum is not killed. Statement and pronouncement from the U.S. Embassy in Kinshasa should be clear and not send mixed messages. It's not always clear on a daily basis where the U.S. stand, viewed from Kinshasa. The United States should reinforce coordinated and sustained effort of special envoys in support of this process. A greater commitment of democratic transition in DRC is needed from its neighbors and also other regional actors. Here I'm thinking specifically of South Africa, which actually has abdicated of its responsibilities. South Africa was the key sponsor of the peace processes in Burundi and in DRC, and since it has been no show in pushing for the respect of that. The United States should insist on opening political space, the respect of freedom of the press and civil liberty of the Congolese, and the right to assembly. We've seen the government cut off signals, transmission signals of broadcasting operators such as Radio Okapi and Radio France Internationale. This also needs to stop. The DRC should follow the recommendation of UN Security Council Resolution 2250 and give youth greater voice in decision-making at all levels, and also allow them space to participate in a meaningful way to peace processes, dispute resolutions, and really contribute to the destiny of their country. It is their country. Political prisoners should be freed so that their rights are restored and as a confidence-building measure for the transition. All I know is that the Congolese people have demonstrated strong commitment to democracy over the last 13 years. They massively support the constitutional referendum in 2006 to allow the advent of democratic dispensation in 2006 and 2011. They have since demanded only one thing of their leaders, and it's not hard to do, to respect the Constitution. So now, whether the DRC knows peace or conflict depends on what their leaders, particularly President Kabila and his associates, do, and what their partners are willing to do, either to support them or steer them in the right direction. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sawyer?
Co-Chairman McGovern, thank you for the invitation to testify. As we have heard from others, this hearing comes at a critical moment in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Less than 3 weeks before the December 19th deadline, marking the end of President Joseph Kabila's constitutionally mandated two-term limit, he still has not made any clear commitment when or even if he will step down. All the while, government repression against pro-democracy activists, the political opposition, protesters, and the media has intensified at an alarming rate. Opposition leaders and activists have called for Congolese to take to the streets if Kabila stays in office beyond his mandate. They will likely be met by security forces quick to use excessive and lethal force. Political leaders could mobilize the dozens of armed groups active in eastern Congo for political ends, or the country's brittle security forces could fracture if Kabila relies on force to stay in power. The country could descend into further repression or widespread violence and chaos, with potentially volatile repercussions across the region, which is why I'm here today. I want to set out for Congress the severity of the situation and the important role the U.S. government can play to help walk Congo back from the brink. Since January 2015, Congolese authorities have arbitrarily arrested scores of activist and opposition leaders, some of whom were held incommunicado by the intelligence services for months, where they were mistreated or tortured, while others were put on trial on trumped-up charges. Pro-democracy youth activists, like Fred Bauma, who is here with us today, were accused of plotting terrorist acts and held in secret detention for nearly a year and a half. Throughout the country, government officials and security forces have repeatedly banned opposition demonstrations and fired live bullets on peaceful protesters. In September, security forces killed at least 66 protesters and possibly many more in the capital, Kinshasa. Some of these victims burned to death when the Republican Guard Presidential Security Detail attacked opposition party headquarters. The bodies of many victims were taken away by security forces. Some were dumped into the Congo River and later found washed up on its shores. The U.S. government, including Congress, has played a leading role in urging President Kabila to respect the Constitution and open political space. But much more could and should be done over the next 3 weeks to help prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. This body's November 15th bipartisan resolution called on the Obama administration to immediately announce another round of targeted sanctions. The administration should heed this call and sanction the intelligence agency director Kalev Mouton, Vice Prime Minister Évariste Bochab, and the Republican Guard commander General Ilunga Kampete. I was in Kinshasa when the United States imposed the first round of targeted sanctions on Congo, and I can assure you it had a notable deterrent effect and rattled those implicated in abuses. It seemed that everyone among the political class and senior security force officers was talking about the list, who was on it, who would be sanctioned next, and what they could do to get off the list. when an estimated 500,000 people took to the streets in Kinshasa a few weeks later to welcome a senior opposition figure, for once, security forces acted appropriately. Not a single incident was reported. Government officials later told me they had made deliberate efforts to restrain the security forces to avoid being added to the sanctions list. But the deterrent effect hasn't lasted forever, and the impact would be greater if the US government now shows it's willing to go further up the chain of command. While joint action with the European Union is ideal, delaying because the Europeans are not yet ready to go forward is an inadequate excuse. Congress and the administration should also continue strong public statements denouncing political repression, and they should press the UN peacekeeping mission in Congo, MONUSCO, to more proactively implement its mandate to protect civilians during political violence. Congress should also work to ensure adequate funds are in place for human rights defenders under threat. At the same time, senior White House and State Department officials should work with leaders from the region, including in Angola and South Africa, and church officials to show President Kabila that he has a way out, and that by stepping down at the end of his mandate, his security and that of his family would be protected. They should also consider officially endorsing the roadmap proposed by a broad coalition of Congolese civil society organizations, which calls for Kabila to step down on December 19th and for the President of the Senate to act as interim president in accordance with the Constitution as presidential elections are organized. This would likely be the best way to prevent further violence and repression and instability and to protect the Constitution and path towards elections. But should President Kabila not step down, Congress and the administration should call for Kabila to, at a minimum, publicly commit to stepping down by a specific date before the end of 2017 and not changing the Constitution. There should then be clear measures to help ensure these commitments are honored and that free expression and assembly will be respected during the electoral period. If an agreement is reached, ideally through mediation by the Catholic Church and before December 19th, strong diplomatic leadership from the US and technical support to elections will be critical. Congress should also work to ensure the incoming Trump administration thinks strategically about how to engage with President Kabila if he retains power by force. Reverting to the status quo would be a real setback. The incoming Congress would need to take every step it can to ensure the Trump administration does not resume a, quote, normal partnership. Congress should support the following long-term steps if Kabila clings on by force. 1, new targeted sanctions moving further up the chain of command. 2, suspend direct U.S. support to the Congolese government. 3, consider bans on U.S. visas for Congolese government and security officials. 4, block bilateral support to the electoral process and support to the Congolese government from the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, unless there is a clear electoral calendar in place, demonstrated political will to implement it, and an opening of political space. Lastly, support efforts to investigate and appropriately prosecute senior Congolese government and security officials responsible for serious human rights violations or large-scale corruption. Members of Congress should work closely with the incoming administration to promote clear messages that, despite what those close to President Kabila have hoped, U.S. policy towards Congo will not change dramatically after President Barack Obama leaves office, and that U.S. leadership will continue, including through the appointment of a new Great Lakes Special Envoy. The U.S. government has the opportunity to play a key role in cementing democracy, the rule of law, and the peaceful transition of power in this country whose stability is crucial for all of Africa. But to get there, President Kabila needs to be given a strong message now that violating the rights of the Congolese people comes at a high price, before there is more bloodshed and it is too late to change course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bouma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for for this opportunity to testify. Before I start, I would like to thank you on behalf of Congolese, of youth of my country and of Lucha movement for the support of the Congress to the human rights and democracy in Congo. 3 months ago, I was in Kinshasa. I was freed from prison when I spent 17 months and 50 days in custody. The reason of my arrest was my fervent opposition to President Kabila and unwillingness to organize the election in order to maintain himself in power by violating the constitution of our country. Unfortunately, my case is not an isolated one, and even not the worst. It even became a normal routine event every single day as we approach the December 19th, a date to which President Kabila should leave the power due to the constitution. The Lucha movement has paid the heaviest price of the fight for democracy. Over 100 of Lucha activists has been arrested, sometimes kidnapped, and between last year and this year. Add to this, the last free press that once broadcast saw the Congolese territory saw their signal being cut, and the Congolese and foreign journalists are regularly attacked, arrested, and sometimes killed just for doing their job. The political space is sufficiently restricted for peaceful activists, which has opened dangerous door to those who believe in violence as a single way to solve conflict. The impunity toward warlords like Gedeon Kyungu in Katanga only bolstered those who believe in violence compared to the harsh repression on peaceful activists. Nonetheless, this repression has not stopped or discouraged our non-violent fight for New Congo. This fight is not in any way a fight against the person of President Kabila. It is firmly to reaffirm our commitment to the value written in our Constitution. It is for peace, social justice, freedom, and dignity, and it is for not reliving the same cycle of violence we have experimented since our childhood. Mr. Chairman, it's unfortunately clear and obvious that there will not be election this year in Congo, and this situation will plunge the country into a serious crisis of legitimacy, which may lead to stimulate political agenda of armed group and still plunder the eastern of the country. And this situation may affect once again all the Great Lake region and possibly beyond. The main excuse of the Congolese government for not organizing the election is lack of funding, when at the same time millions of dollars of Congolese people is being spent in corruption and by Congolese government to finance lobbyists in for the US government, including Congress. Some individuals close to the current government are involved in large-scale looting of resources, corruption, and large-scale diversion of public money, as revealed in recent scandal of Panama Papers, and even in many reports of international anti-corruption NGOs such as Global Witness. In coming days, Congress, I would suggest to Congress to actively push the U.S. government to apply more financial sanctions against those Congolese national and foreigners involved in many financial malpractice and scandal that continue to impoverish the Congolese people. I therefore ask the Congress and this Commission to increase the surveillance on the fraudulent financial transaction in US dollars that is handled through US financial institutions and which benefit to those who incessantly continue to consume the lives of innocent Congolese people. Sanctions should also absolutely be taken against all Congolese individuals directly involved in the repression of peaceful protesters and also responsible for violation of human rights throughout the country. I will request that this sanction to be taken should not only be symbolic, but should target individuals in the entourage of the President Kabila, because in my opinion, this sanction has not the purpose, should not have the purpose to punish the people, but to be used as the pressure on the government in order to compel them to respect the Constitution and avoid violence. This is why this sanction should be taken in time before December 19, in order to be useful and effective in preventing violence. It is very important to the United States to act now, because I'm afraid that tomorrow may be too late. Lastly, I should end this testimony by talking about Beni and that territory of Eastern Congo, where for 2 past years, innocent Congolese men, women, and children are horrible beings slaughtered and massacred with machetes, forcing thousands of Congolese to fly their home and villages. All this happening under the impassive watch and presence of MONUSCO, the biggest United Nations mission in the world, with a budget of more than $1 billion every year, which the United States remain the major donor. The failure of MONUSCO in carrying out his peacing mission in Beni, as well as in the situation in Congo, mean the failure of the United Nations to truly fulfill his duty. The Congress should use the United Nations to ensure that MONUSCO truly plays its role of peacekeeping organization and not being a simple government partner, when in fact this same current government is being a major source of danger against the security of Congolese people. You have the power and the chance to change the current situation in order to avoid Congo be the next Burundi, the next South Sudan, the next Central Africa. We have started a long journey toward freedom, and we ask, as Congolese, we ask Congress and American people to join us in our side and the side of Congolese people and the Constitution. We ask you to be on the side of peace through prevention. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your powerful testimony, and I'm glad that you're here and no longer in jail. But it's a real honor to have you here, so thank you for your testimony. Mr. Lezhnev, welcome.
I appreciate the pronunciation of my name. Thank you, Congressman. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Congressman Govern and other members of this Lantos Commission for drawing attention to the Congo today during this critical time. Tom Lantos was a personal inspiration to me in his lifelong fight against oppression, and so it's an honor to testify. The commission named after him and alongside Fred, who spent 17 months in jail for his beliefs against oppression. The Congo, as we've heard today, is facing a pivotal turning point in its history. In this light, I would like to focus my remarks on what the U.S. government can do now to help prevent a wider escalation of the violent crisis, together with the private sector and European allies, and the key role that Congress can play. President Kabila's attempt to hold on to power risks taking the country back 15 years to mass violence and the absence of the rule of law. On the other hand, a successful democratic transition would help move the rule of law forward, increase security across the country, including in conflict-ridden eastern Congo, and lay the foundation for responsible businesses to invest. The repression, corruption, and violence in the East we are seeing today are the latest manifestations of a wider systemic problem in Congo, that of violent kleptocracy. As the Enough Project highlighted in a recent comprehensive study that I authored, A Criminal State, ruling networks in Congo and their commercial partners have hijacked governing institutions and maintained impunity in order to extract resources for personal gain and maintain the security of the regime. A recent Foreign Corrupt Practices Act case highlighted that Congolese officials received over $100 million in bribes, and a key Congolese bank run by the president's run by the president's brother and 40% owned by the president's sister was caught in a corruption scandal, BGFI DRC. Ruling elites then use varying levels of violence to maintain power and repress dissent. This system is manifesting itself now with the current regime's attempt to subvert a democratic transition, as it has in driving war in the East. Kabila and his inner circle profit from corruption and are trying by all means necessary to hold on to power. The key to changing this equation, preventing a wider violent crisis, and starting the process of reform away from this system of violent kleptocracy is to impose serious consequences on those leaders and their business partners who profit most from violence, illicit resource extraction, and undermining democracy. We applaud the Catholic Church mediation effort, and this should also be accompanied by policies to improve governance, human rights, and transparency. But those negotiations and policies need leverage to succeed. I would argue that the United States has leverage that it can bring to bear in this situation. President Kabila's inner circle relies on financial transactions denominated in U.S. dollars, many of which pass through the U.S. financial system. This gives the United States the ability to use certain tools that can create financial pressure in order to prevent the escalation of violence and a constitutional crisis. These tools have been used to counter terrorism and nuclear proliferation in other areas of the world. It's time to use those tools to prevent costly humanitarian crises and atrocities in Africa, including in the Congo. I would argue that a three-part strategy by the U.S. government utilizing that leverage would help move the negotiations forward. This combination would strongly support Congolese efforts to change the system. Congress should urge the Obama administration to take some of these steps immediately, and if the Congolese government makes progress on the benchmarks by the 1st of January, it could avoid an escalation of pressure. First, financial pressure through anti-money laundering measures. Congress should urge the U.S. Treasury Department to take measures to counter money laundering activities that transit from banks in Congo to the international financial system. Together with key European governments, particularly Belgium and the UK. Specifically, the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, should issue a public advisory concerning the patterns used to launder the proceeds of corruption from Congo. FinCEN issued an analogous advisory related to Ukraine. Such an advisory should include discussion of the correspondent banks used by Congolese banks to connect to the international financial system. This should entail several sub-steps in an escalating manner. First, FinCEN should issue a request to banks under Section 314A of the Patriot Act to counter money laundering activities connected to the regime and key elites. This request would demand vigilance by U.S. banks and lead to more vigorous reporting of suspicious activities. This would not cut off the general Congolese population from the banking system, but rather be directed against a specific list of individuals and entities. Another sub-step would be for the State Department and Treasury Department officials to meet directly with U.S. and European banks that do business with Congolese banks and or Congolese officials and express concern about corruption and money laundering from Congo moving through the financial system. If these measures fail, FinCEN could escalate by issuing a foreign financial agency request, which requires specific institutions to provide information on particular types of transactions. FinCEN could also declare certain institutions or classes of transactions as primary money laundering concerns under Section 311 of the Patriot Act and impose special measures. Number two, political and financial pressure through enhanced targeted sanctions. The U.S. government should designate a short list of high-level officials and advisors with strong influence on President Kabila. The designations conducted so far during 2016 have been a good start, but will not change the DRC government's stance on elections unless higher-level targets are designated. Kabila's top financial advisors and heads of state-owned companies should also be targeted. It is important that sanctions not simply be name and shame, but have real financial impact. The U.S. and other governments should learn the lessons of other sanctions, in particular that they must aggressively enforce those sanctions against properties and accounts in the United States and abroad, and conduct diplomacy in countries where the designees have assets. Applied smartly, sanctions can be used to prevent crisis rather than punish its perpetrators after blood has already been spilled. If these measures fail, the United States should increase the pressure by targeting senior Congolese politicians, enabling business partners of the regime, and possibly even members of Kabila's family. Such designations would demonstrate seriousness of U.S. pressure. Looking forward, Congress should urge the Trump administration to issue a new executive order on Congo that expressly includes corruption as a reason to place targeted sanctions on individuals in Congo. Third, appointing a U.S. special envoy. The crisis in Congo and the Great Lakes of Africa requires sustained policy attention, particularly during this critical period. The special envoy position is thus critical to moving policy forward, and the past two envoys, Tom Perriello and Russ Feingold, have proven that point. Feingold helped negotiate the end of the M23 rebellion, and Perriello has made measurable progress in reducing repression and helped preventing mass atrocities from occurring in Burundi. It is imperative that the next administration continues the special envoy position and appoints a new person to that job as soon as it begins. The United States has been the leader on international policy in Congo, as Europe has been too slow. Without an envoy, Kabila will take advantage of the U.S. policy gap and move ahead rapidly to subvert democracy. The envoy should report to the White House or Secretary of State so they have proper authority. Finally, I would urge Congress to take 3 steps that would help constrain the overall environment for violent kleptocracy. It should pass the Global Magnitsky Act, championed by yourself and Representative Smith in the House. Secondly, it should keep Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which has been the backbone of progress on conflict minerals. And third, it should increase appropriations to FinCEN and OFAC, the entities at Treasury responsible for anti-money laundering efforts and sanctions. In conclusion, the U.S. now has an opportunity to be on the right side of history in Congo. With the right combination, financial pressure and diplomacy, it can work with the Congolese people and help them have their first ever peaceful transfer of power and prevent a violent crisis that would risk breaking apart the Great Lakes of Africa again, costing thousands of lives, subverting the will of Congo's citizens, creating a terrible investment climate, and costing hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to respond. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Thank you very much. This was an excellent panel, and there's a lot of information here. The way I'm looking at this is we have a short-term challenge, and then there's a longer-term challenge, and it goes back to what the first panel talked about, the effort by the Catholic bishops to try to work out some sort of a deal by the 19th, and it seems to me that a lot of our efforts, at least in the short term, ought to be on how do we increase the pressure so that there's actually some good news that comes out of all of this on the 19th. I don't know whether there's progress being made or not, but it seems to me that we ought to, that's a short-term goal that we ought to be trying to pursue here. So I guess I'd like to maybe get all of you to tell me, what do you think of this process, and what specifically can we do in these next coming days, because that's all we have, to try to achieve a positive result. Mr. Lezhnov, you just went through a whole series of things. Some of them may fit into this short-term window, and what I would like to encourage you to do is to work with our staff here to maybe we're happy to put together a bipartisan appeal to the administration. Maybe the Enough Project already has submitted a request to the administration. We're happy to support that. But again, I'm looking at trying to, I worry that if something doesn't happen positively by the 19th, then we're going to be talking about this whole situation in more dire terms, where there's going to be more violence and more political repression. And I'm hoping that maybe that we all push harder, that maybe we can avoid that. But so I'd like to may have anybody who wants to, all of you want to comment on what do we think of this process, and what can we do specifically? What can Congress do? What can the administration do to make this a success?
I may start then.
Yeah.
I think first of all is the acknowledgement that all parties are not created equal in this process. We have a government, one side. We have a president who holds the key to the impasse. I think we need to continue engaging the president directly, not his surrogates. He has plenty of those, and that's a waste of time for everyone. To engage the man who holds the key to the solution, is the president, and impress upon him the importance of the respect of the Constitution, to impress upon him the importance that he discharges the leadership that has been entrusted to him twice, 2006 and 2011, and to respect the Constitution that he himself held in front of his people and said that he will be the guarantor of that. It's not the end of the world. He has a resume, has a track record, but I think he holds the country hostage. And we need to acknowledge that and engage through the process through that. The Catholic Church is only as strong as the process or the mandate that it receives. If today people are not willing to go along with the Catholic Church, it's because they don't see an end game. If the principle does not say that he will uphold the Constitution, and here's the way he's going to do it, then for a big chunk of the opposition, The opposition is fragmented, yes, but the heavy hitters in the opposition are not going to join. Some of them in exile, some of the youth leaders in exile, some of them are in jail. There's just not enough goodwill for the key stakeholders to come along to this process. And I think institutions like yours have to start at that point. Thank you.
Sawyer?
I would agree that the Catholic Church mediation does remain the best hope that we have now to finding a solution before December 19th, but it's only going to lead to a consensual agreement with a broad coalition of the opposition leaders and the majority if President Kabila makes some concessions. And unfortunately, we're seeing in recent weeks that he just appears to be increasingly defiant. It was very evident during the UN Security Council's visit to Kinshasa when Kabila said clearly that, yes, the Constitution has a term limit, but the Constitution can be amended. So I think we do need to see more pressure on Kabila before the 19th to show him that the consequences are real and that it would be in his best interest to stop the escalation of these consequences and do the right thing for him and for the country. Targeted sanctions is something it's ready to go, as I understand. It's something that can happen quickly before the 19th, so that's one clear step that can be taken. And as Mbemba said, working with regional leaders, trying to get to Kabila himself, showing him that this is the best option and the best way forward is critical. So working through the president of Angola, with South Africa, with others, and trying to get as many people to President Kabila himself is critical here. But time is short, but I think those two aspects are needed.
Yeah. Mr. Palmer?
I would like to add to what Ida and Mvemba said, that in the process of Senko, of the priest, is maybe the last chance we have to avoid violence and things like that. But I think the principal problem in political space in Congo is the lack of trust within all the parties. And this mistrust is we can see it with constitution. Both parties, especially the government, doesn't respect any agreement they had with opposition in the past. Even in Congolese people, we have the constitution, which is such a huge agreement with everybody, and which is not respected. So the lack of trust doesn't create a space in which people may have a talk and go to an agreement that it is sure that it will be respected. And the President Kabila has the key to bring the solution to that. It's very simple for him to say he will not run for a third term, to say it very clearly, and not just saying he will respect the Constitution, while we know the interpretation of the Constitution for them is very different for what the Constitution say. So President Kabila, if he says clearly he will not run for the first term, if he engages himself to respect fully the Constitution, and if he creates a space for dialogue in freeing all those opposition leaders who are in jail and civil society activists, it may be the first step to really give show to people that he really wants to bring a space for that dialogue. And I think another thing is that, and to come to that point, I think the such sanctions may be important to show to add pressure to him and people around him to know that if there is killing, if things turn worse in the end of December, people will hold them accountable. They will be responsible for what will happen. And I think maybe regional leaders may be involved in this process, although we know that the problem of Congo is the same thing that's happened in Brazzaville and in country surrounding us. So as a Congolese citizen, I really doesn't have any confidence in regional leadership, because I know it is the same kind of leaders.
I would just add that I think the Senko mediation effort is good. They have the trust of both sides. But I think the real issue right now is that Kabila and the government doesn't really have a reason to make any concessions right now. And so any deal that it would agree to would be a bad deal for the Congolese people. I think the mentality right now, as the others highlighted here, is that, well, we can throw some people in jail, shut down some media stations, control information, and intimidate democratic protesters by rolling out the tanks and the presidential guard. I think that, so therefore the leverage is needed to help push that process forward and really allow the government to make some concessions there. I think the congressional resolution on Congo that was passed recently was excellent. I'd really like to thank yourself and Representatives Royce, Smith, Bass, and Engel for pushing that forward. I think now we need something to help engage the administration directly and say, look, we need some steps taken now, because otherwise, there will be no good deal at all. If the government doesn't make any other concessions, then we will escalate those steps. So perhaps a meeting of a few members with some senior officials. We understand that Ambassador Rice and the National Security Council is increasingly, heading the administration's policy on Congo. So I would urge either a meeting or a call or perhaps letter to her to move the situation forward.
We're happy to do that. And again, I mean, in terms of some of the specifics that have been mentioned in the testimony here today, work with us to get so we can turn something around very quickly. And look, I think we all believe that an agreement just for the sake of an agreement that doesn't do anything is not a solution. We want an outcome by the 19th that is reasonable and rational and takes into consideration all sides and respects the opposition. But also something that is believable, something that can be enforced, and something that can be monitored, and that has consequences for those who don't keep their part of the bargain. I mean, short of that, then you don't have much of anything. I mean, I think the goal here is to try to avoid what I think is almost certainly will happen if there is no agreement, and that is more repression, more violence, more civil unrest. And I think that is just a bad deal for the people. Who have already suffered so much. We've talked about the crackdown on opposition. Does anyone have any idea of how many political prisoners right now are behind bars, approximately? And I mean, the government tells us that they've released people and all this kind of stuff, but I understand there are a lot of people that remain behind bars, and there continues to be intimidation and threats. What are we talking about, Ms. Sawyer?
We at Human Rights Watch, we have a list of 29 senior opposition leaders and other political prisoners who are still in detention, cases that we've documented where they were clearly arrested for participating in a peaceful political meeting or demonstration, or because of what they said, calling for the Constitution to be respected. There have been dozens of other people arrested in the past few weeks. Some of them have been released, some of them are still in detention. Hundreds of people were arrested during the September 19th demonstrations. We have not been able to document all of those cases to see if perhaps some of them were involved in violence, but at least 29, but the actual number is probably higher.
Mr. Bouma, in your testimony, you mentioned a list of 35, quote, democracy predators, who, in your view, should be subject to citizen sanctions. What criteria do you use when you put people on that list?
I think the name of those people is really known and very well documented by Human Rights Watch, by Enough Project, by UN Office of Human Rights, and by so many NGOs. And we can see in Congo, we know there is those reports, there is information that we receive every day of their action, and there is also clear influence from them, clear information, clear power that they have around President Kabila and that's the influence they can have to them. There is also among those people who are being how can I say it? People whose name appear in so many scandals like Panama Papers, like Lumumba Papers, the last one in Congo, and in other many reports which show their link with in mineral resources, in business, unclear business, and in human rights violation. That is kind of people.
Mr. Lezhnev, in your testimony, you argue for a credible interim government after December 19th. So what factors or characteristics would lend credibility to a transitional or interim government?
Well, I think that it's important to have meaningful participation by the opposition. It can't be, one representative, one splinter faction. I think that there needs to be confidence build up with the Congolese people that, in fact, there will be election held by a certain date, and that's got to be in 2017, not 2018. I think also that the Congolese people are waiting on the edge of their seats to hear the announcement that Kabila will not participate in those elections. In fact, he will step down at the end of that transition. I mean, let's not forget that there have been many different dates named. April 2018 is the latest one. If we move past December 19th with no deal, no credible deal, that could easily be pushed further and further and further. So it's really important that we get some key benchmarks together now. And I think the strategy that Special Envoy Perriello is pursuing with the benchmarks is good. I think the problem, though, is that we don't have enough, we have a lot of bark behind them, but not much bite to make them work.
Mr. Desolele, you, maybe you could help me understand the mind of President Kabila. Like, what is this about? Is it power hungry? The access to money. Why won't he let go? Is it just kind of the same old story that we see with others around the world who are addicted to power? Because part of the deal here is, to do everything we can to encourage him to respect the Constitution. But I'm just trying to understand, and if others have comments on this too, I just think it's probably important to get on the record.
Well, Congressman, I think only Kabila knows what is in his mind. But this is what I would just say within the context, I think is really, that gives us a bit of a sense. I think there was a lot of hope in Congo in 2001 when President Kabila came to power. He was young. He didn't grow up in Congo, so there's a lot of disconnect between the history of the individual and the people in the country. But people trusted him. People were willing to take a chance on him, particularly because he was young, which is kind of the irony today, because there's a big conflict between his regime and the youth. People saw him as a break from the old regime, from the old people who had been bickering in Kinshasa. Nobody questioned, people were not happy about the succession from father to son, but they were willing to give him a pass, including the opposition, including people like Tshisekedi, hoping that this young man will take the country to the next level. It would just appear tremendous hope. We saw a little bit of that happen with the Sun City Accord, which brought various warring factions and civil society to guide us to the elections. And then people continue to hope that will continue rising to the occasion. But that has not happened. And I think in part it's not happened. In my testimony I said he had been abated and aided and abetted by foreign powers as well. The international community did not challenge the system enough when they start going astray. Instead, the world made excuses. Well, the country is out of the conflict. This is better than Mobutu. Give the men some slack. That became the MO of the world community because they so much wanted him to emerge. That has not happened. So I think we need to face that music. He's done a lot of good things. We've heard that, a couple of them, Sun City Accord, the reunification of the country. But Congo is a big country. It's the size of Eastern United States. It's not the task of one person. The Congolese are tired of cult of personality. We had that with Mobutu. We had that with others in Africa. people are just committed to moving forward in their country. But to give another context, Fred is here. Fred is 26. That's how old he is. And a year and a half of that he spent in detention. So when Mobutu left in 1996, Fred was, he was 6. He was 6 years old. So now he's a leader. He's an emerging leader. And we're still talking about where is the country going. So I just think the time to understand what is in head or somebody else's head is actually, well, gone. It's spent. The time is to get back to the drawing board and say, this is what you had committed to do. The international community babied you and really helped you to rise to the occasion. Everything, including the Constitution, was customized to accommodate President Kabila at the time because he saw a lot of potential.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did that. They changed the age from 35 to 30 so he can qualify. They decide, well, the majority is going to stay. They decide during the transition, unlike what we did in Liberia, that they can run for the presidency, which was the source of the problem, because during the transition, the warring faction should have been prevented from running in 2006. This was successful in Liberia. That's what we didn't have in Congo. So these free passes that accumulated over time have come home to roost. So I think we need to show enough guts and gumption and to say simply enough is enough. You're spending a lot of money on DRC, billions of dollars, to the UN, to election, to humanitarian process, and none of this stuff is working. Instead, the Congolese government has wasted money. They had an economic boom to the commodity boom. They're reducing the budget from 8 billion, which was peanuts, now going on 4.5 billion, and asking civil servants to reduce their salary by 30%. How much more sacrifice do we expect of the Congolese, of the Fred Baumas, of our youth who've been literally sacrificed too long? And I think that's what we actually need to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So that's...
Appreciate that.
I'd like to add just a little bit to that. Let's not forget that Congo is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world. There's an estimated $24 trillion worth of copper, cobalt, tantalum, tin, gold, diamonds, oil, you name it, in the ground in Congo. And people either within Kabila's family, senior officials, other business partners, namely Israeli businessman Dan Gertler and others, have personally profited from deals on these natural resources, most of which have been opaque and not made transparent. One of the lessons from the study that we did over the last 15 months was that, you know, in fact, the history of Congo shows that if you don't stay in power, you will lose everything. The elites don't transfer, by and large, from regime to regime. And so there's an intense fear by all those individuals and businessmen who are profiting from those deals that they will lose everything. And so, and those people would have no future in a next regime. And so I think, you know, part of the key is, number one, to enact some consequences for those individuals to say, well, you know, you can't just continue personally profiting from that. That's not fair to the Congolese people who should be profiting from their natural resources. And then number two, allow some sort of an exit strategy for some of those people to have personal security and some future in a next process. They just don't have confidence in the next process. So those two things I think are key.
Maybe should I add that even if we trusted Kabila for a very long time and we are disappointed every time, I think in the mindset of Congolese people, there's still that idea that if Kabila says today he will not run, people will consider him like a hero, as Pedro was saying. And maybe should I use this as an opportunity to send him a personal message for young people, for the youth of Congo, that they still have a chance for him to come in the story like a hero, like someone who bring hope and someone who led the country to a change. Of course, maybe he didn't succeed all his 2 term, all his 15 years, but he can go and let the country run by someone else. The important is the step he made, and let someone else let the country, he still have an opportunity to get in the story like a hero. I use Kabila to take that opportunity and to let people be proud of him.
Thanks. Just want to add that Kabila he's become accustomed to power. He's accumulated a massive amount of resources. He's surrounded by other leaders in the region who have managed to cling on by force, change their constitutions. He probably also doesn't know what his entourage, those around him, would do if he were to step down. And I think, it's impossible to know exactly what's in his head, but I think fear of what would happen after is probably a factor. His father was assassinated, Lumumba was assassinated. What will happen, could he be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court? What will happen to all of his assets? I think this is probably among the factors that he's considering. So what can we do now? I think it's the message that Fred just gave showed that there is a way out, and that if he steps down honorably now, his security could be guaranteed, and he does have a future ahead of him. And that's, trying to get that message across.
Well, I want to thank you all. This has been a great panel. It's been very informative for me, and we've been making notes up here of kind of like the to-do list, like now, that in terms of follow-up. Look, the previous panel comprised of Mr. Malinowski and Mr. Perriello, two people I have great admiration for, and I know they care deeply about trying to get this right, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for what they have done. And I think they would appreciate pressure to do even more, in these next couple of weeks, and we're happy to do that. And I think, Fred, as you pointed out, and as the previous panel pointed out too, there's an opportunity here for everybody to come out of this winners. It's just a short window right now, but if President Kabila is concerned about his long-term security and his place in society, that can be ensured now. But if these negotiations don't provide, with the bishops, for example, don't amount to anything, and you see an increase in violence, then you're going to end up with people calling for international investigations and accountability, and then you're down a path where there's no return, where you cannot be salvaged or cannot be rehabilitated. This is a moment right now that the president and his advisors either need to take, or they're going to go down a very different path where they'll become international pariahs. And I think for a lot of us, it seems obvious what the right path is, but it's sometimes very hard to convince people in power to think in a rational way. And we've seen that in a lot of countries all around the world. But in the short term, again, we're in session for the next couple of weeks, and we want to be able to continue the pressure on the administration, send the right signals to the government about what we think is important. And I think there's one other thing I just want to state for the record. I have no idea what President Trump is going to be about. I really don't. I wish I knew. I can't tell you what's in his mind. I don't even want to think about it. But anyway, but I will say this. In many respects, that's beside the point, because I do think that it is clear, based on these resolutions that we have passed in Congress, that there is strong bipartisan support, in favor of President Kabila respecting the Constitution, of respecting human rights, of there to be a transitional government if that's what we need, and to move beyond this impasse, and that's not going to change. And we may actually pass the Global Magnitsky Act as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is coming up this week. I know it's going to be in the Rules Committee, which I'm also on this week, so it'll probably be voted on this week, and I assume it will pass the House and will pass the Senate, and so that'll be codified. And so that will be another vehicle for us to put pressure on people. And the other thing, too, is, look, targeted sanctions at individuals, I think, is a better way to go than broad sanctions that hurt a lot of people. And there are people that, Mr. Lezhnev, you have mentioned, and others, who are doing quite well, and who are utilizing U.S. banks and resources, and they need to know that there's a consequence if this thing goes bad. And so I thank you all for being here, and I look forward to working with you in the next few days and see what we can do to up the ante here. And if not, we will come back and do another hearing next year. I hope we don't have to. I hope that we're all going to be pleased at what happens in the next few weeks. But thank you very much. This hearing has come to an end.